Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. So today we're going to take it back old school to YA that was popular when I was your age. No, I'm not actually that old, but I do think that I kind of live in an interesting in-between space for YA. So I came of age during the Harry Potter craze, and it's not that YA didn't exist before then, because that's ridiculous. Of course it did. But in terms of sort of the intensive marketing of YA, that was kind of a new thing. And when publishers saw how well Harry Potter was being received and how much that was inspiring reading, they really amped up their efforts to sell to young adults in particular. So prior to that, there certainly was a section of the library or a section of the bookstore that was dedicated to literature for, let's say, middle school to high schoolers, but it wasn't quite as ubiquitous. And I definitely remember only having one other friend who I knew was reading YA along with me. So I thought it might be fun to kind of take a little turn in the time machine and talk about some of the books that I really loved when I was in middle school and high school, some of which you've probably heard of and some of which you may not have, but I thought it might be interesting to see kind of which titles endure. So the first book that I want to talk about is Time Enough for Drums by Anne Rinaldi. So Anne Rinaldi was a very popular author when I was kind of late elementary school through middle school. A lot of my friends were reading her. Again, I don't know that we knew it was YA, but now even looking on the back cover, it says randomhouse.com/teens. So yes, it was for teens. And what Anne Rinaldi wrote, and I don't know, maybe she still does, I'll have to look into that, but she wrote a lot of essentially historical fiction for teens. And I think what's cool about these is that it's always a kind of strong female protagonist, but in the context of American history. So the two that I remember most are The Last Silk Dress, which is about a young girl growing up in the Confederacy during the American Civil War and essentially coming to realize that maybe the things that she's been told are so glorious about the South or maybe not so glorious about the South. And then this one is the one that I kept and I still have to this day, and I will still reread sometimes. It's about a girl growing up during the American Revolution, and her family is very staunchly patriot, but her tutor, with this sweet, I can't tell if it's a mullet or if that's like some sort of gun behind his head. Anyway, he has some pretty sweet hair on this cover. This is her tutor, who she thinks is a loyalist, and so she really resents him, and of course they fall in love. I mean, it's YA, right? But anyway, this is a really, really good book. I think that it's pretty well written, and I think it does a nice job of kind of weaving in the historical components, which is something that Anne Rinaldi is clearly very interested in. Like, rereading this, it's very clear that she wants the reader to walk away having learned something about the historical period. But I don't think that it's heavy-handed. Like, it doesn't feel like a lesson when you're reading it. And she just has very engaging characters, I think, and she does a nice job of sort of putting her characters in major historical events in a way that doesn't feel too clumsy. Like, it feels pretty organic. So this whole line I would really recommend. I remember really loving these, and again, this is the one that I've held on to over the years, and I actually even bought it in ebook form because I really love it. The next one that I want to talk about is One for the Morning Glory by John Barnes. So I'm not sure that this is specifically YA. Looking at it, it doesn't have any kind of earmarks of being specifically YA, but I do remember buying this in a book fair when I was in early high school in a section of kind of fantasy or sci-fi for beginners, kind of a display. And I think what really stands out to me about this book is that it's what made me fall in love with the whole idea of a fairy tale being retold. Not just the elements of the story, but also in the author kind of trying to match the tone of a fairy tale. So I think when you think of this book, you can think of something like The Princess Bride, right? So it's something that's trying to emulate the tone of a classic fairy tale, not just the tropes. So this is about a young prince. I think his name is Amadeus. Yeah, Amadeus, something like that. And, he is told not to drink the wine of the gods, but, Of course he does, because we wouldn't have a story if he didn't. And literally half of him disappears. So I think it's only his left side that he has left. Ha, pun. So he only has one side left, and he gets these 4 tutors who show up, who eventually will help him on his quest to kind of regain wholeness, which is a pretty obvious metaphor, but it works. I think the other thing that stands out about this book, and probably why they chose this as sort of like a YA fantasy type book, is that it's really funny. Like, I remember laughing a lot in this and enjoying its sort of high, wry tone. Again, very reminiscent, I think, of The Princess Bride. So if you like The Princess Bride, I would recommend this. And again, not necessarily YA per se, but I do remember being kind of marketed this as something that young adults would enjoy. So the next one I want to talk about is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones, or Diane Wynne Jones. No. Diana Wynne Jones. I get to say that I liked this book before it was cool, so I just picked this up randomly at Borders one day. It was not displayed prominently, it was just sort of tucked in the shelves, and I was really just drawn to the cover, which I think is kind of beautiful. And of course this has been turned into a very good animated film, and it's very popular now, but back in my day, only me and my friend Jolene had read this, and we both really enjoyed it. So this is the story of Sophie, who is just sort of minding her business in a hat shop one day when a witch comes in and is not pleased with her purchase from said hat shop. So she turns Sophie into an old witch. And through reasons, basically, Sophie ends up working for a local wizard whose castle is always moving around, and who has a fire demon is his kind of curmudgeonly companion. A lot of things happen in this novel, and I don't really want to give anything away because I think it's so worth reading. It really holds up even today when I reread this occasionally. I very much enjoy it. I think it's a nice balance of whimsy and kind of fun, but also some really interesting world building, and I think a very nice introduction to fantasy in general. So I think Howl's Moving Castle is a classic and deserves to be so. So the next book is Sabriel by Garth Nix. This is obviously a classic as well now, but I remember when this came out and kind of feeling like I'd found something really special. So I read this, and again, my friend Jolene also read it, and I remember us just talking about this book for hours together and slowly realizing it was becoming popular and more of our friends having read it. This is the story of Sabriel, hence the title, and she is the daughter of the Ab person. And basically probably the best way to talk about him is he's the guy who makes sure that the dead stay dead, and he does that through a series of magical bells, which you can see on the cover. She's ringing one, and she gets word that her father has died, or is at least trapped kind of between the two worlds, and this is about her quest to go find out what exactly happened to him and to kind of come into her own as the new Ab person. So there's a whole series of these, which I started to read and frankly didn't get that into, and so really I kind of made the decision as a teen that I didn't want the series to spoil my original feeling about this book, because this book I think is just beautiful and perfect. I think that this is such a great novel about finding your place in the world and finding strength that you didn't maybe know you had, and figuring out how to do that in a way that doesn't compromise your own integrity. So, and of course also set in a really interesting fantastical world. And actually you'll notice that there's a lot of fantasy on this list, and that's because I think as a young adult reader I read a lot of fantasy, or sort of at least sci-fi-y, paranormal-y things. That was a lot of what was available. So I remember loving this book. I still love this book. This is my original copy. I bought it the other day on ebook, and I thought about getting rid of my paperback, but I just couldn't. I have so many warm memories of reading this specific copy, and it's, in the original paperback release. So I love this book, and I hope I always will. Okay, the next book is actually not technically YA. It's really a children's book, but I distinctly remember reading this as a young adult. and that is The Westin Game by Ellen Raskin. This book is essentially about a millionaire who's died and who sets up in his will a kind of puzzle game for a bunch of people to compete to see who's gonna win the money. And I really don't want to say much beyond that. They all live in a certain building, and this is so good. I mean, it's a Newbery Medal winner, so of course it's kind of consensus is that this is a great book. And again, it's not technically YA, but I think it's so enjoyable, and it really, I think, helped me love mysteries. In terms of books not written for adults, like mysteries not written for adults, but for children or for teens, this is really the first one that I fell in love with. And I remember loving figuring out like the puzzles and watching everybody kind of either work together or against each other, and I think that this just really holds up. I'm actually looking forward to doing a reread of this sometime soon because it is just a great book, and now that I have the nice fancy hard copy of it, hardback copy, I'm glad that it will be in my collection for many years to come. Okay, so next up is Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. So this book released when I was 13, I think, and it was the first book that I ever went to a overnight release party for. I remember going with a bunch of my friends, and it's not just that this is a fantastic book. I mean, obviously this is a fantastic book. I know this is a lot of people's favorites, and it was my favorite until the 7th one. But I also just, the memory of this and having been a part of sort of the spectacle around this book is part of why when I think of YA literature, I think of this in Harry Potter as opposed to like The Deathly Hallows, which is probably my actual favorite Harry Potter book, but this is the one I read as an actual young adult. So this is the one that I'm going to kind of pick to represent Harry Potter. But yeah, Harry Potter was a huge part of my young adult reading, and not just, I don't think this is really a book that cemented me as a reader, but I think that this was a book that got so many of my other friends really interested in reading. So I think of this as sort of like a community building book for me when I was a teenager. Harry Potter provided sort of like a common language for a lot of my friends to speak together because a lot of us had read these books. So Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, not that original or inventive, but it's a classic, and yeah, it kind of started, I think, the craze of young adult that we see today. So the last two books that I have to talk about, I don't actually have the physical copies with me right now. I'm not sure if they're maybe at my parents' house or if they got given away at some point. I still think of them very fondly, and I still talk about them with my friend Jolene whenever we encounter them out in the wild. So yeah, the first one is The Circle of Magic Quartet by Tamora Pierce. So I'm actually really sad that I didn't read the Alana books when I was that age from Tamora Pierce, because from everything I've heard, she sounds like a complete badass who I would have been so excited to read about. But I didn't read those. I did read The Circle of Magic, and my favorite of those was Sandry's book, which is the first one. And it's about 4 young mages who go off to live in a cottage with instructors and learn all about their magic and overcome, you know, various toils and strife in the process, of course. And I remember Sandry's book, I think because it just introduced the world and I really fell in love with all the characters, was my favorite one of those. But I also really remember liking Daja's book. Anyway, I kind of want to pick those up again because I bet they would hold up pretty well. But yeah, I remember loving those books. And again, I did read a lot of kind of fantasy and magic-based books as a young adult, but there were a lot of good offerings there. I think maybe that's one of the biggest differences between now and when I was a young adult, is that there weren't a lot of contemporary YA that was really that great. I say that. If you have ideas about young adult books that came out in the early 2000s that were contemporary YA, leave it in the comments, because I don't remember that being a big part of what I was reading or what was available, but maybe I just wasn't interested in it and therefore just wasn't as aware of it. But if you have ideas, leave them in the comments. So anyway, those were some of the YA books that I remember really enjoying when I was a young adult, kind of in middle school, high school, through early college. But I'd be curious, what are some of your favorite YAs? If you're, you know, a little bit older like me, I'm almost 30. Were you reading some of the same books as I was? Were you reading different ones? If you still read YA, what are you reading now? All these things. I would love to hear your thoughts. So Leave a comment below. If you want to continue to see content from me, hit the subscribe button, and just stay well till then. Bye bye.